Sometimes it's my phone. Sometimes we don't know what it is, but here we are. Anyway, I answered the first question. I answered that question about Libya. Now, religious opposition to progress is the next super chat question we have. Religious opposition to progress. But before I answer that, if someone can post the link in the old stream so we don't, lose everybody. This happens. It's frustrating, but here I am. I don't stop. I keep going. Like I said, I keep going. They knock me down, and I keep coming. I am relentless, and you should be relentless too. If you can be relentless, you can be successful in life, and our socialist movement needs people that are relentless. So there you go. Religious opposition to progress. Religious opposition to progress. Now, there are many religions that argue that the past, the present, and the future are equal, right? That the world is constantly getting better and it's constantly getting worse at the same time, right? We're heading toward the apocalypse, but the age of enlightenment and spiritual teachings are also expanding, and that there is no progress in history. It's all the same. It's all the same. History is not marching forward. That is a big view in some of the, and it's interesting because a lot of Protestant religious groups do believe in human progress, right? If you look at especially the concept of the Protestant work ethic, et cetera, it tends to be tied up in, a belief in capitalism and the free market. But Protestant Christians tend to very much believe in historical progress, whereas Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox folks tend to not. They tend to argue that, that basically, we're just kind of, this is a fallen world since the time of Adam and Eve, and that history is just kind of, it just goes through, things get better, things get worse, but they're always pretty much the same. That's not my belief. I do believe in historical progress. I do believe we are advancing. I do believe in the dialectic and the advance through history, and that change comes through contradiction, and that the struggle to reach a higher mode of production is driving that advance. So that is my understanding of that question. But there you go. That's my response to those who would deny historical progress. But, look, I'm not here to tell anyone that their religious beliefs are wrong. But my belief is that historical progress is pretty essential, right? And if you don't believe in progress, if you don't believe tomorrow is getting better than today, that's when things go wrong. Next question. Malcolm X and socialist ideology. Well, there's a lot there. So as you know, Malcolm X, he was from New York. He was from the Boston area, and he also hung out and spent some time in Harlem. Eventually went to prison. While he was in prison, he was recruited into the Nation of Islam, which is an African-American religious group in the United States. It was actually started by a guy named Master Farad, and later it was Elijah Muhammad became the leader of it. And that Malcolm X became like the top minister in the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam preaches a black nationalist message. And the Nation of Islam, while it's not a Marxist organization, they are sympathetic to anti-imperialism and anti-colonial struggles. The Nation of Islam, its members refused to fight in World War II because they didn't want to fight against, the Japanese who were not white. They didn't want to fight for the white man against non-white people. The Nation of Islam supported Mao and supported Fidel Castro and supported, the Korean people and Kim Il-sung. And even though they were not a Marxist group, they are a religious sect that has they have their own beliefs, which are very much a mixture of, they pull concepts from the Bible. They have their own specific interpretation of the Bible. And thank you. I will keep up the good work, and we do need a government of action to fight for working families. They have some beliefs from the Bible. They have a particular interpretation of the Bible. They draw from the Quran. They believe that Elijah Muhammad, their founder, was a prophet. It is an American religious group, and Malcolm X was the top minister in that religious group. He later had a falling out with Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, eventually became independent. And as Malcolm X became independent, he dropped the teachings of the Nation of Islam and became a Sunni Muslim. And when he was a Sunni Muslim, he was also associating himself with a lot of different anti-imperialist groups. He went to Algeria and met with revolutionaries in Algeria. He went to different parts of Africa and met with revolutionaries in different parts of Africa. In the United States, he began associating himself with the Socialist Workers' Party. A lot of people don't know this, but Malcolm X, he spoke at the Militant Labor Forum. And that was a gathering, the Militant Labor Forums in the Socialist Workers' Party. When they would have speeches and events with speeches, they were called Militant Labor Forums because their newspaper was called The Militant. And Malcolm X spoke at a Militant Labor Forum. And the Militant newspaper, which was the newspaper of the nation of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Trotskyites in the United States, they republished Malcolm X's speeches and published interviews with him. So Malcolm X had a relationship with the Socialist Workers' Party. Now, I know the Workers' World Party also republished Malcolm X's speeches and writings and also made a point of supporting black nationalism. And a lot of the Maoist groups, Progressive Labor Party, and some of the various Maoist regroupments also supported them. And I guess there was a big fight among communists during the 1960s. One of the biggest differences was the Communist Party no longer supported black nationalism. At the 1957 convention of the Communist Party, the Communist Party declared that they did not consider black people to be a nation anymore. They did not consider black people to be a colonized nation within U.S. borders. They considered black people to be a group of working class people who faced discrimination, but they no longer recognized that black people were a nation. And Gus Hall and the leaders of the Communist Party did not support black nationalism. So as a result of that, the rival communist groups, the Trotskyites, Socialist Workers' Party, and the Maoists, the Progressive Labor Party, and other communist groups became sympathetic to black nationalism. The Workers' World Party, various other communist parties supported black nationalism and criticized the Communist Party for not supporting it. And Mao, became very vocally supportive of black nationalism, welcomed Robert F. Williams to China when he fled. Fidel Castro broadcast Radio Free Dixie from Cuba, broadcasting black nationalist messages. Whereas, the Communist Party supported Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement and argued that black people were not a nation. They were just workers who were discriminated against and, didn't have their civil rights. And that was the division. The more radical forces, the Maoists and the Trots, they thought that black people were a nation. The Communist Party thought black people were not a nation. Now, later, it got more complicated. In the early 70s, you had the Che Lumumba Club of the Communist Party, which was led by Angela Davis. And it was black members of the Communist Party who worked with the Black Panthers, right? They were not in the Black Panthers. They had their own wing of the Communist Party, but they were more radical. And the Che Lumumba Club carried firearms, which the Communist Party had tended to oppose people carrying guns. But in about 1969, 1970, Angela Davis and her faction of the Communist Party, friendly fascism. Okay, they started carrying firearms. Let me write it down. They started carrying firearms, and they were black nationalists, or at least sympathetic to black nationalism, which was very different, right? That had not been the position of the Communist Party. And eventually, the Che Lumumba clubs dissolved, and the Communist Party did, oppose black nationalism again. But there were shifts, okay? There were shifts, and Angela Davis. There was kind of, I'm sorry, we're jumping all around here, jumping all around. It'll be all right, folks. We're going to survive. All right, cool. Sorry about all the technical difficulties we're having. Doing the best I can. All right, so, Angela Davis and her grouping were more sympathetic to black nationalism and worked with the Black Panthers, and there was a united front between the Black Panthers and the Communist Party. After the re-election of Richard Nixon, they formed a united front against fascism. They had a joint conference in San Francisco, I believe, in the Bay Area that was dedicated to defeating fascism. It's complicated. But Malcolm X, prior to his assassination, he was hanging around with the Socialist Workers' Party, but he also had a relationship with a very important group, all right, military spending in USSR. He also had a relationship with a very important group called the RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM. A lot of people don't know about the RAM, but the Revolutionary Action Movement, it was a group of young black activists who were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. right? And that was a wing of the civil rights movement, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by Stokely Carmichael. They're the folks who first started using the word black power. They're the ones who invented the word black power. And many of the members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, it's referred to as SNCC, S-N-C-C, many members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were secretly members of the Communist Party. You know, back then, the Communist Party, they were almost illegal. They were practically illegal. They were widely hated. So it was very secretive. But many members of SNCC had been members of the Young Communist League and the Communist Party. But when the Communist Party took its position in 1957 against black nationalism, there were a number of people that were involved with SNCC who quit the Communist Party. Or as they got more radical, they got involved with SNCC, they were in the Communist Party, but they came to the conclusion the Communist Party, because it didn't support black nationalism, wasn't radical enough. So within SNCC, within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you had kind of an underground group that was formed. It was called the RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM. And RAM, one of the things that RAM did was it was people who listened to the broadcasts of Robert F. Williams. Robert F. Williams, was a leader of the Monroe, North Carolina NAACP, who'd fled to North Carolina, conservative socialism. All right, fled to North Carolina. Fled North Carolina, fled to Cuba, and was doing these radical broadcasts calling for a black revolution from Cuba, Robert F. Williams. And the people who listened to those broadcasts, who listened to Radio Free Dixie, and were involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, formed kind of an underground secret society called RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement. It's called the Revolutionary Action Movement. Malcolm X went to meetings of the Revolutionary Action Movement and considered himself to be a member. Now, he wasn't really an active member. He was never a Marxist. He did not agree with their ideology, but he made a point of supporting the RAM and going to their meetings and saying he considered himself to be a member. And that was a very important gesture for Malcolm X, this very important black leader to make, was that, he was making clear he was a member, he was a sympathizer with the Revolutionary Action Movement. And it's also worth noting that before the Black Panthers were formed, that, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were both members of the Revolutionary Action Movement. And the RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement, was kind of a precursor to the Black Panthers. So the fact that Malcolm X was hanging out with the RAM, which was a black Marxist group, the fact that he was speaking at militant labor forums from the Socialist Workers' Party, the fact that Malcolm X was speaking very positively of revolutionaries and meeting with Marxist revolutionaries in places like Algeria, all of that indicates Malcolm X, becoming more and more sympathetic to Marxism, more and more anti-capitalist in his mindset. But I would say Malcolm X was never a communist. He was never a Marxist-Leninist, but he was more and more sympathetic to the global revolutionary and anti-imperialist movement of the time. Absolutely. And it's worth noting that the actual writings of Malcolm X are to this day owned by the Socialist Workers' Party. Pathfinder Press, which is the publication of the Socialist Workers' Party, that's the publishing company of the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party, which is a Trotskyite group that has really taken a very negative turn in the last couple decades. They're not revolutionaries anymore, I'll tell you that much. They may have been a little bit better at one point, but Trotskyism is counter-revolutionary in essence, and they're definitely some counter-revolutionary Trotskyites. They own the copyright to Malcolm X's actual writings. Now, the autobiography of Malcolm X was not written by Malcolm X. The autobiography of Malcolm X was written by Alex Haley, who was a Republican and a conservative, and it was edited by Harvey Braverman, and then it was re-edited by the FBI. The FBI took a number of parts of that book out. So there's the autobiography of Malcolm X, not by Malcolm X, but there's the actual writings of Malcolm X, like Malcolm X Speaks to Young People, Malcolm X on Black Nationalism, those writings, right? If you find them in a Barnes & Noble, it'll say Pathfinder Press on them because it's owned by the Trotskyites. It was Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X's widow, who sold them the publishing rights. So that's kind of an interesting detail. And also the fact that Betty Shabazz sold the publishing rights to a group of Trotskyites. That also indicates Marxist, that Malcolm X was becoming more sympathetic to Marxism. So there you go. There you go. All righty. Alrighty. Next question. Japanese communists in World War II. Well, there was a very big underground, illegal, secretive communist party in Japan during World War II. And they engaged in underground activism. They would get jobs in military manufacturing facilities, and they would, in those military manufacturing facilities, they would sabotage the bombs and the tanks and all of that. All right. Is there a quote? Is there a quote on replacing revolutionaries? All right. There's actually probably the most famous work in Japanese Marxism is a novel. It's a revolutionary novel called Crabship. That's what it translates to. I mean, I don't know how to say it in Japanese, but it's called Crabship. And it tells the story of Japanese, workers on a crab ship going on strike and fighting for their rights. And the guy who wrote Crabship also wrote a novel about the underground resistance of the Japanese communists during World War II. And it's particularly good. Another thing that's important to note is many of the communists in Japan during the Second World War were not Japanese. They were Korean, because there were millions of Korean slaves in Japan that had been taken to Japan from Korea as slaves, to do slave labor for the Japanese fascists. And many of the Koreans in Japan who were working as slaves were sympathetic to communism. And after the Second World War, when they got the opportunity to go home, the overwhelming majority of Koreans in Japan that got freedom after the war went back to North Korea, not South Korea. That's how influential the Communist Party was among Korean slaves in Japan. A lot of people don't realize that. That during World War II, the Communist Party of Japan was underground, it was secret, and it was probably majority Korean during that time. Another important thing to know about the Japanese Communist Party is that after World War II, maintained a significant base among the population, and they still maintain that. They have not, increased and become the ruling party, but they have been a consistent political party. Japan has been largely run by the Liberal Democratic Party since the end of World War II. Right? If you look at the history of Japan since the end of World War II, one party, the Liberal Democratic Party, pretty much is always in power. And it's funny because, if that was a socialist country, they'd be like, oh my God, it's a dictatorship. One party in power for so many years? But it's it happens in Japan, which is an imperialist Western country, so no one cares, right? It's an imperialist country in Asia, Pacific. And they're just like, okay, whatever. One party's in power all this time. Shows how ridiculous and selective our media is. But the Liberal Democratic Party has been in power in Japan since the end of the Second World War. But the Communist Party of Japan has maintained a significant base among the population. They were legalized after the Second World War. They've maintained a very, very significant base. I will say that in the late 70s, the Japanese Communist Party, 1978, 1980, they became a Euro-communist organization. They adopted, the Euro-communist anti-Soviet perspective. They're like the French Communist Party. They're like the Spanish Communist Party. They're like the former, no longer existing Italian Communist Party, which is now called the Democratic Left. They no longer are even calling themselves communist. They adopted a Euro-communist perspective. And actually, the Social Democratic Party of Japan is more radical than the Communist Party. It's really weird how this works, but the Social Democratic Party is a coalition. Social Democratic Party has like tankies in it, and it has MLs, and it has trots, and all of that. And the Communist Party of Japan is a Euro-communist reformist party. So it's complicated, right? And that's why the Social Democratic Party in Japan is smaller than the Communist Party, because they're more radical, right? The Communist Party is considered pretty moderate compared to the Social Democratic Party. So, put that in your pipe and smoke it. It's all confusing. But yeah, the Japanese Communist Party at this point is a Euro-communist party. But I will say, before we move on to the next topic, phalangists that opposed Frank. My gosh, where do these people come from? All right, phalangists that opposed Franco. Pan-Hispanic. All righty. So, one of the most beautiful stories I ever heard. And this was after the Japanese Communist Party had become reformist, after they'd adopted Euro-communism. 1991, I believe, the World Communist Gathering. I've been to 2 of these communist gatherings. The World Festival of Youth and Students, the one in Sochi, Russia, I was in 2017. Before that, I was in 2013 in Quito, Ecuador. They had it in 1991 in Pyongyang, in North Korea. It was this huge communist festival, huge sports stadium, thousands, tens of thousands of people piled in to see this big parade by all of these communists from around the world. The American communists, Canadian communists, Russian communists, African communists, Asian, Chinese communists. It's a global gathering of communist parties that happened every 4 years. The World Festival of Youth and Students still goes on. They had it 1991 as the Soviet Union was falling. They had it in North Korea. And the Japanese Communist Party got a standing ovation, and people sobbed and cried their eyes out for them. In Korea, which not a good history between Korea and Japan. But, they're announcing the different parties. Cuba walks in, they've got the Cuban flag, everyone applauds for them. Canada walks in, everyone applauds for them, they got the Canadian flag. And in that auditorium, many people will never forget the day that in Pyongyang, in North Korea, they announced, and now the delegation from Japan, and they walked in without their flag, with no flag. And the audience of thousands of Koreans burst into tears and gave them a standing ovation, because that was a big deal. Because that was Japan recognizing that waving the flag of Japan on Korean soil would be deeply offensive because of the ugly, ugly colonialism that had gone on. And so when they marched in, when hundreds of Japanese communists marched in to the stadium without their flag, that was a huge moment where the whole auditorium just burst into applause. And they saw that as a great victory against imperialism. So that's one thing that happened. So now that's one thing. And, I have my criticism of the Japanese Communist Party, but the fact that they, in 1989, walked into the auditorium, the stadium in Pyongyang without their flags, that was such a beautiful gesture to the Korean people that, got to give them their credit. All right, G.K. Chesterton, and thank you, Io. Thank you very much. G.K. Chesterton was, he was conservative, a Roman Catholic living in Britain, and he was a critic of capitalism from the right. He was a critic of capitalism. He thought capitalism was inconsistent with Roman Catholic teachings, and he was associated with a school of economic thought called distributism. The idea is that government power should be, localized as much as possible. You should not have a big, strong national government. You should have a local government, but that local government should control the economy on a local level in order to make sure people don't go hungry and people have jobs and all of that. And it's a Roman Catholic response to Marxism, because Marxism was very popular in England and Britain, before World War I, big socialist groups and all of that. G.K. Chesterton, and his, it's a lot like Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin was the anti-Semitic radio priest here in the United States who denounced capitalism, but was always preaching against the Marxists and the revolutionaries. And G.K. Chesterton was very opposed to the concept of historical progress. He said that historical progress was sinful. And actually, I've quoted, it's funny, in my recent speech in Central Park, which, I gave, and I'll quote it now. I don't have it memorized, but there's a very famous poem, that they used to make, like boomers. A lot of old boomers will know this poem because they used to make kids memorize poems in school. They don't do that anymore. That might be a good thing to do, but for this poem, it's not particularly good. But there was a very famous poem written, it was written by Joyce Kilmer, who was an associate of G.K. Chesterton. And he wrote, I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree, right? And it was this poem about how basically human beings, nature and God are the source of real beauty. Human beings should just submit and let nature rule over them. because human progress is an illusion. And the last line of the poem is, poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree, right? And that's kind of, you get that from Father Coughlin, you get that from G.K. Chesterton. There's a belief that human progress is the Tower of Babel, that humans, we can't go so far, that human beings are, we're incapable of marching ahead, and that when we try to build and advance, it only leads to things getting worse. Pessimism. It's pessimism. And yeah, G.K. Chesterton, it was like, we need to bring back kind of the tradition and authority that comes with feudalism and apply it to capitalism, and that'll make it okay. And that's distributism. That's distributist economics, and I don't agree with that. And I don't agree with G.K. Chesterton, and I don't agree with Joyce Kilmer, and I don't agree with distributism. So there you go. I would be happy to debate Sam Cedar. I'd be happy to go on with Sam Cedar. I bet you anything he won't have me on. I think that Sam Cedar, I think it's very unlikely that he will have me on. After I'm done with this stream, I'll tweet at him, and I'll tell him that I'm happy to be his communist guest. But I can almost guarantee you, I bet there is a 90% chance it won't happen because of who I am, because of who I work for, because of my reputation internationally. If he's going to have a communist on, it's going to be Jabba the Vosh. Maybe, it depends what he wants to do with the interview, right? If he wants to have a real conversation, he would have somebody like me on. But if he wants to actually give a platform to somebody, it'll be a fake leftist. If he wants to debate and denounce somebody, he'll find someone inarticulate, probably like one of the spokespeople for, one of the obscure communist groups, that'll have them on there. You've seen the infamous Sam Webb interview with Glenn Beck. That if he wants to do something like that, where it's like, well, I'm a democratic socialist and you're an evil Stalinist, he'll get, a buffoon. If he wants to have a real discussion, he'll get a fake leftist on. But we shall see. We shall see. So there you go. I'm open to it. 90% chance it won't happen, but I'll do it. I'll generally do it. Yeah, So there you go. All right. Fusion City is unrealistic. How is it unrealistic? If all the countries in the world working on fusion energy were to combine their resources into one facility and one united effort, and it was no longer a competition, and they were given the resources and the skills of the whole world to build Fusion City, I think it's very realistic. Look how quickly they were able to make the atomic bomb with the Manhattan Project during World War II. And that was only the resources of one country. That's only the resources of one country. So imagine if they were to make the resources of the whole world and to combine the resources of the whole world into one facility, one united effort, we would have fusion energy within a year, within 2 years. It's not too late. And the person who told you it was too late is wrong. They're just simply wrong. So there you go. Martin Luther was a very brave person, a very, very brave human being. He was a Roman Catholic priest who saw that indulgences and the system where you basically paid to have your sins forgiven was corrupt. Stalinist insult was corrupt, and it was corrupting the Roman Catholic Church and its religious behavior. He saw that, and he opposed it, and he nailed his thesis to the walls of the church, right? I believe it was in Germany, and he nailed his thesis to the walls of the church. That was a very brave thing to do. He risked being burned at the stake as a heretic, but there were enough people in Germany at the time who sympathized with him that he led a breakaway, and he formed the first, Protestant church, the Lutheran Church, right? That was Martin Luther. Martin Luther was very anti-Semitic. He wrote vicious things about Jews that are awful. And he also was a defender of feudalism. As much as he was criticizing one of the main institutions of feudalism, the Catholic Church, when the peasants revolted, when German peasants rose up against feudalism, he supported the feudal aristocracy in executing them. So he was a mixed figure, but the role he played largely, he got the ball rolling. He got the ball rolling by, being one of the first people to come forward and challenge the Vatican, right? He challenged the Vatican, and he said, you're corrupt, and having people pay to have their sins forgiven, that doesn't work. And not being able to have the Bible in your actual language, but having the Bible be in Latin so ordinary people can't read it and they just have to do whatever the clergymen tell them, that's not good. He challenged the Vatican, and his actions eventually led to the overthrow of feudalism in Europe. I mean, they got the ball rolling in the overthrow of feudalism. But, like I said, he was an anti-Semite. He wrote vicious, hateful things about Jews. That's pretty awful. He opposed peasant revolutions and supported the brutal repression of the peasants, so that's not good. And again, you got to stop viewing history in terms of good guys and bad guys, right? Martin Luther was a mixed figure. Anti-Semitic, not good. Anti-peasant, defending feudalism, not good. But challenging the feudal system and the main institution that propped up feudalism, the Vatican, good. He was a mixed figure, right? And throughout history, that's how most people are, right? Most people are like that. And we've got to get out of this cancel culture where we judge people like as if there's good people in this world and there's bad people in this world. Because that's not a good attitude to have in life, too. I mean, get beyond the internet. But in real life, if you have that attitude that there's good people and bad people, eventually everyone is going to disappoint you. There is no flawless human being in the world. And it's one of the personality disorders, it's a certain personality disorder. It's like borderline or something, where it's like you meet somebody and you think that they're flawless, and then they let you down, and then you hate them. And it's not a healthy way of viewing the world. You have to increasingly recognize that as you know people, you're going to find their limitations. This applies to personal relationships. Look, everybody watching this, I will let you down at some point. I will. There will be some point when I'm doing this stream where someone's going to ask me a question, and I'm going to say something, and you are going to go, God damn it, Caleb is so wrong about that, and you're going to be angry, and you're going to be... And you know what? That's just life. I am going to let you down at some point, and you are going to let me down at some point. If you have a relationship with me in real life or on the internet or whatever, at some point, you are going to make me mad. You are going to disappoint me. And when that happens, that's good. It's good, because then I realize your limitation, and you realize my limitation. You say, hey, Caleb's good up to this point, but if we get to this topic or we get to this aspect of his personality, he's not so good. And in a healthy relationship, discovering someone's limitation, discovering someone's boundaries is a good thing in a healthy relationship. In an unhealthy relationship, right, where you think the person is infallible, and then you discover that, oh my God, they have flaws, and then you hate them, that's the setup for an unhealthy relationship. If you want to have healthy relationships with people, you have to understand people have their limitations. And that applies to politics as well, right? Martin Luther, right? I think what he did, challenging, the Roman Catholic Church, was great. But do I think that he was good when he preached hatred for Jews? No. Do I think he was good when he put down peasant uprisings? No. Right? Do I think he was good when he said that women should be the property of men? No. Right? And that I can recognize his contribution and also recognize his flaws. And, the same can be said for leaders of communist countries. Right? I can recognize the contributions of Mao or Fidel Castro or Stalin, and I can also recognize their flaws. And, the same for the founders of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, these people, Hamilton was always opposed to slavery, didn't own any slaves, that's good. But, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, they were slaveholders. That's awful, it's reprehensible, right? That was awful, and I think that was reprehensible. But does that mean that we can't learn from some of their rhetoric? No. Does that mean, I think the debate between the economic theories of Thomas Jefferson and the economic theories of Alexander Hamilton is very important. It's very important, right? Alexander Hamilton was a progressive, and Thomas Jefferson was a reactionary. But because of the settler culture, Thomas Jefferson appeared to be a populist, right? He was a settler populist. His economic theory of the yeoman was about, he was for the small farmer. And Alexander Hamilton, who believed in economic growth and believed that the economy of the USA should flourish, he was friendly with a lot of Wall Street bankers. But Alexander Hamilton was the progressive one because he was against slavery. He wanted to recognize the Haitian slave government, and he wanted the state to control the economy in order to foment economic growth. So he was the progressive, even though he was hanging out with Wall Street. And Thomas Jefferson, even though he was hanging out with poor farmers and he was rallying the poor farmers, what did those poor farmers want? They wanted to steal land from Native Americans. They wanted libertarian economics and privatize everything and no taxes and all of that. Thomas Jefferson was reactionary. Alexander Hamilton was progressive. But Alexander Hamilton still believed in capitalism. He didn't understand, he was not a Marxist. And Jefferson, he wrote very eloquently. He was a very good writer. The Declaration of Independence is very stirring. It's very exciting and radical. He was a good speaker and a good writer. So it's complicated, right? We need to assess people with a clear head. And that applies to historical figures like Martin Luther. So there you go. All right. The creation of millionaires in socialism would create a new ruling class with the ability to buy off the government. So let me take this apart. From a number of angles. First of all, millionaire does not refer to class, right? Capitalists are owners of means of production. Many millionaires are capitalists. But millionaire just means one possesses $1 million, right? And if we're ever going to have communism, we would need all of humanity to live in far greater luxury and have far greater abundance than millionaires have in our current time. So the goal of communism would be for everyone in all society to live and a greater level of abundance and a greater level of splendor than even millionaires. So even that first thing off the bat, right? Millionaire is just a measurement of wealth. We want all of society to have vast wealth. So the idea that we would cap wealth, at $999,999, right? But if anyone becomes a millionaire, the idea that whenever you can't cap human progress. So anyone who starts saying, well, we want human progress to stop at a certain amount, that in and of itself is anti-Marxist, okay? And so there's that. But then I think the more direct question the person is asking, though, is if we allow people in socialist societies to become exponentially wealthier than everyone else, not to have wealth, but to have more wealth than others, that's the important point, to have more wealth than others, won't that lead to them then buying off the government? And my answer to that is no. And the reason for that is that socialist governments tend to draw their support from a well-organized population. For example, I've been to Iran, and I've seen with my own eyes that there are millionaires and billionaires in Iran who are terrified of the Iranian government. Right? The biggest economic entity in Iran is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a military force. Right? Yugo-Soviet split. All right. Yugoslavia, which is a military Soviet split, which is a military force. A military force that is only accountable to the supreme leader of Iran. And in every neighborhood in Iran, they have these things called Basij councils. And there are a lot of millionaires in Iran. There are a lot of billionaires in Iran. But they're terrified of the Iranian government, because if you get on the wrong side of the Iranian government, it doesn't matter how much money you have, you're screwed. And why are they terrified of the Iranian government? Because the Iranian government draws its support from this network of well-organized population, right? In every neighborhood, they have these Basij councils and all of that. And yes, you can become wealthy, and if you're wealthy, you probably have more influence than like any individual person. But the state is far more powerful than any individual millionaire. And it's like that in China, too. The Communist Party has 90 million members. It controls all the major economic entities, and the millionaires and billionaires of China live in terror of the Communist Party. And they're having a big crackdown on corruption right now because, yes, there is bribery that goes on, and that the Communist Party is cracking down on that. But in a socialist society, the state is not just bought off by billionaires because the state is exponentially more powerful than billionaires. The state has a well-organized population to back it up. The state controls the major economic players. And so if somebody becomes a millionaire because they started a tech company, if somebody becomes a billionaire because they arranged, a bunch of real estate deals and brought in some foreign investment, they don't really have very much power compared to the state, which draws its support from a well-organized population, that controls the major centers of economic power, that can just knock them over at any time, right? So that's a fair question. You got to get the millionaires part out. When you mean capitalists, right? Private individuals who become wealthier than everybody else, right? What's the danger? They won't buy off the state. The state doesn't need to buy them off. The state doesn't need to be bought off by them. The state is exponentially more powerful than they are. The state has a population to back them up, and that doesn't happen. Alrighty. Someone said, what about friendly fascism? I mean, fascism is not friendly. By definition, fascism is mass destruction and terror done in the hopes of stabilizing the capitalist system. Nothing friendly about it. Nothing friendly about it. So, friendly fascism is an oxymoron. Next question. If it's friendly, it ain't fascism. And if it's fascism, it ain't friendly. Next question. Military spending in the USSR. Well, the military spending in the USSR hurt the economy. The fact that they were forced to spend lots of money on military defense, the fact that they were constantly, it was not an arms race. Michael Parenti often talks about how it was not an arms race, it was an arms catch-up. It was an arms catch-up. The USA would develop a new missile system, then they'd have to keep up with it. And then the USA would develop a new missile system, and then they'd have to keep up with it, right? They had to make sure that they could deter a US strike. If the USA, had nuclear weapons to attack them, they had to have the ability to retaliate, to prevent it. And the arms race bankrupted the USSR. They spent lots and lots of money on it. It hurt them. It's not what ultimately brought down the USSR. The USSR was ultimately brought down for political reasons. It was the political confusion inside the party, the rise of the westernized reformist wing, the Gorbachevists, were basically, behind the scenes didn't believe in communism anymore. That's what brought down the USSR. That said, though, the military spending certainly hurt the Soviet economy. No question about it. No question about it. There you go. And in the United States, the military spending was actually a stimulus, right? Military Keynesianism, and that was one of the problems. The Soviet Union, when they spent money on the military, it cut into civilian programs, it cut into things they needed. When the USA spent money on the military, it strengthened the private sector, it strengthened the private military corporations. So there you go. All righty. Conservative socialism, according to Marx. It's people who want to bring back feudalism. All right? In Marx's day, there were a lot of people that were critical of capitalism, thought, hey, capitalism's bad, why don't we just go back to feudalism? In feudalism, everyone knows their place, everyone follows these strict religious rules. Why don't we go back to feudalism? Capital flight from China. There you go. Why don't we just go back to feudalism? And that's what it was. Someone once joked with me that they've never heard of any conservative socialist in America except for the Beach Boys. Remember? Everybody's gone surfing USA. I thought it was a funny joke at the time I heard it. Maybe it's not so funny, but nowadays there aren't many people walking around saying, by golly, can we bring back some feudalism? I want to see some feudalism. Like I said, during the 1930s and, now with the rise of some of the Catholic anti-capitalism, you start to hear people that say, well, can't we go back to a more traditional society in capitalism? Can't we bring back some of the feudal traditions, some of the patriarchal traditions, some of the religion? But no one really at this point is saying, all right, let's have a nobility. No one's saying that nowadays, right? I mean, there's very little, there are some people on the internet that think they're monarchists or whatever, but no. Yep. At this point, even the most reactionary forces are just saying to go back to a more traditional or more primitive form of capitalism. So there you go. All righty, next question. Is there a quote talking about how genuine revolutionaries are replaced by figures like Obama or whatever? There is pages and 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 pages written by Marx and Lenin and Stalin and Mao and Fidel. There are pages written condemning social reformists and revisionists. Pages. I mean, it's one of the main topics. It's one of the main topics that Marxists write about. And that's why I will say there is this movementarian attitude that you would get in some left circles where they're like, why are you writing polemics, man? Can't we all just be comrades? We're all comrades, man. Why are you writing books disagreeing with other socialists, man? We're all in the protest cage together. It's cool. We're brothers, man. We both want socialism. You like Stalin. I support U.S. imperialism bombing Libya. But hey, we're all in this together, man. Why are you always trying to divide the movement, bro? We can all smoke a bong together. It'll be cool. That's not Marx's. That's not Lenin's attitude. That's not Marx's attitude. Wasn't Engels' attitude. Wasn't the attitude of any communist in the world, right? I wrote this book, BreadTube Serves Imperialism, because if Marx were alive today, and there was this big entity called BreadTube, they would be out there calling them out and criticizing their ideology. If Lenin were alive today, he would do the same thing. The polemic is an important part of the Marxist tradition. And why? Why is it an important part? Because it's important to call out people who are wrong and show who's the real... No. Because of dialectics. This is how you learn. When someone comes forward and says, this is what I think, and someone comes forward and says, well, this is how I see it, and then people listen to both of those people, that is how you learn, right? This is the Socratic method, right? Socrates, the Socratic dialogues. Read the Socratic dialogues. Where Socrates just sits there and asks his followers questions. What about this? Well, what about that? That's how you learn, right? Why do you think you raise your hand in school and ask questions, right? This is how you learn. This is how you learn, right? Knowledge is advanced through the contending of ideas. This is how you learn, right? So the polemic is a very important part of the Marxist tradition, right? No, we don't advance our movement by sitting around going, hey, we're all on the same team, bro. Bro, we're all on the same team, man. Why are you always disagreeing with people? No. Obviously, there are hyper-sectarian individuals. There's certain Trotskyite groups, then you read one of their magazines, and every single article is a critique of some other group, and that's not productive. And there is, when people are talking to their own little corner of the internet or their own little, radical circle, and they're not talking for the broad masses of people, they're speaking incoherently, they're using a lot of, in-talk and in-language words that no one can understand. Obviously, that's a problem, right? Anything in extreme excess is a problem, and there's plenty of extreme sectarianism, extreme polemicism among Marxists. That said, no, I think that there's endless amounts. To answer your question, there's endless amounts that's written about the topic of fake socialists. Yes, there are current international effort to develop fusion energy with the International Thermonuclear Reactor. In what ways would Fusion City in the U.S. accelerate and expand this effort? Very good question, Dana Annex. Very good question. Fusion City, expand these efforts. Very good. I will answer that for sure. Okay. What about the phalangists that opposed Franco and advocated for a pan-Hispanic world? I have no knowledge of that. Franco was a vicious murderer. He would execute people by strangulation. He executed Basque people who were fighting for their independence. He executed communist labor union organizers through strangulation. And a lot of people don't realize that that Franco was a lot like Jabba the Vosh, and he was a lot like Skippy the Bear in Thought Slime. He called his ideology, before he became a phalangist, he called it national syndicalism. Did you know that? He was an advocate of worker cooperatives. Yes, he was. Yes, he was. Look it up. Franco went around saying, oh no, we don't need communism. We don't need Marxism. We don't need the means of production to be controlled. We're going to start national syndicates. We're going to start worker cooperative enterprises where the workers and the capitalists are good buddies and they run the company together for the good of the nation. and we're going to use the Spanish monarchy and the traditions of the Catholic Church to build a syndicalist movement, right? And actually, Franco was very inspired by this guy, a name that you want to talk about synthetic left, you should know who George Sorel. George Sorel. This guy, George Sorel, who was a syndicalist and is the father of national syndicalism, right? And George Sorel was a big inspiration on Mussolini, and he was also a big inspiration on Franco. And Franco was criticism of capitalism, but also opposing socialism. The idea, originally it was they were going to form these syndicates where, inspired by the monarchy and inspired by the Catholic Church, there would be these corporations formed by the state where the workers and the capitalists would cooperate for the good of the whole nation. Look it up. So actually the ideology that Skippy the Bear and Jabba the Vosh and Ben Burgess and all of them put out is much closer to what Francisco Franco believed than what Marx believed or what Lenin believed. National syndicalism, Sorelianism, this is very much a reactionary deviation. So this cooperatives fetish, but I don't know about this opposition to Franco. There were many currents within Spain, within the Falangist and pro-fascist movements of Spain in the era. I know he executed a lot of the rivals. So there you go. Right? When Jabba the Vosh says no, socialism is an employee stock ownership program, what he's advocating is a lot like what Franco and the national syndicalists believed. It's a lot like what George Sorel believed. It's a lot like what Mussolini put out with his corporate state. That's what the corporates were in Mussolini's, fascism. The corporates were these bodies where the workers and the capitalists would work the company together. And, this is the idea. We don't abolish production organized for profit. We just have some kind of scheme where the workers get a share of what they produce. Or so, this is an old deviation, and fascists are some of the primary promoters of it, right? Social democrats generally want to move towards socialism gradually, and they're not really anti-imperialist, but they at least understand that they want to get rid of profits in command. They want to get rid of an economy organized to make profits for a group of private owners. Jabba the Bosch, Skippy the Bear, they don't want that, right? Jabba the Bosch, he said on his broadcast, he said that socialism is everything being exactly the same, except every company is a worker cooperative. That's what he said. He doesn't want to get rid of production for profit. He doesn't want to break apart the huge multinationals that dominate the world and keep it poor. Everything is exactly the same, except there's an employee stock ownership program. It, becomes cooperative. That's what he believes. And that's what Mussolini believed, and that's what Franco believed, right? This idea that, we'll form these corporates where the capitalists and the workers work together and for the good of the nation or whatever, and it'll still be for profit, and the capitalists will still be driving to make as much profits, but we'll make sure that workers get a share of it somehow, and that's fascism. That's national syndicalism, that's Sorelianism, that's Mussolini fascism. So there you go. Just saying. But actually, that's not fascism. Fascism is anyone who doesn't support U.S. imperialism bombing Syria. Fascism is anyone who doesn't immediately believe the lies we're told about China. These people are idiots. They don't understand whatever. Anyway, next question. Why is Stalinist an insult? Well, one of the biggest critics of the term Stalinist was Stalin. Stalin did not like the word Stalinist. He hated the word. Hated it. Said it was not consistent with his ideas. Stalin was not a Stalinist. If you read the speech of Stalin to the U.S. Communist Party, his famous speech to the Communist Party USA, Stalin met with J. Lovestone and William Z. Foster, who had two rival factions of the U.S. Communist Party, and he calls them out. And he says, one of his big criticisms of both factions, both the J. Lovestone faction and the William Z. Foster faction, is that both of them were claiming to be Stalinists, right? They both wanted to prove that they were the better faction. Lenin had died, and so they were going around and saying, there's this new leader in the Soviet Union, Stalin. We're actually the Stalinist faction of the party. Those other guys, they're still Leninists, but we're the Stalinist faction. You should be in with us. Stalin heard about this, and he said, get rid of that. Nope. There's no such thing as a Stalinist. I am a Marxist-Leninist. We are a Marxist-Leninist party. So Stalin himself was probably the harshest critic of the term Stalinist. Now, the Congress for Cultural Freedom and Trotskyism have turned Stalinism into this, it was a way that, it was like, oh, we can be socialist just so long as you hate all the existing socialist countries. They're all Stalinist. And generally the term in academia, Stalinism generally refers to actually existing socialism, the Cold War economic model. And in that case, what they call, in German, they call real socialism. It's like one word, real socialism. AES, actually existing socialism. In academia, they'll say Stalinism. What they are referring to something real, which is the economic and political model of the USSR that basically came into existence starting in 1928, when Stalin first defeated Trotsky, and then he defeated the Bukharinites. And, where you have 5-year economic plans, you have the rule of one party, you have a very charismatic leader at the center who's encouraging everyone to work very hard. That model of organizing an economy has been, it had great successes. It raised the USSR up out of poverty and defeated the Nazis. It made China a world superpower. It's the reason, that North Korea is still around. It's the reason that Cuba is still around. But ultimately that model doesn't work forever. You have to adjust it. It's not a permanent way of doing things. It starts to creak and moan after a generation or so, after the revolutionary enthusiasm wears off, and after the country reaches a certain stage of industrialization. That model needs to be adjusted, right? And Cuba is adjusting it. Vietnam is adjusting it. Korea would like to adjust it more. China has adjusted it. So, it gets you over the first stage, right? If you're a country that is not fully electrified, doesn't have running water, doesn't have electricity, the Communist Party comes in, right? And they nationalize the means of production. And they have this really charismatic guy who gives fiery speeches, and everyone's mobilized to go and build for the nation, go teach people to read, go build hospitals, go build schools, go build power plants, go for the good of the country. And the people who work the hardest get a pay bonus and an incentive, and they get an award, and the leader goes around to the factory and he shakes hands, and the worker walks into the factory, the great leader walks in, and all the people start crying because the great leader is there, and he gives them an award for making the most steel, or drilling the most, or growing the most wheat or whatever. And it's a very effective model for the first stage when a country has been kept chronically poor by imperialism. That stage, right? That what you can call Stalinism or actually existing socialism is very effective for electrifying the country, wiping out illiteracy, industrializing, building a modern farming system, But after the country fully industrializes, after everyone can read and write, after everyone's got access to medical care, after the revolution has been 30, 40 years before, at that point it starts to slow down. It starts to slow down because people are like, okay, we did it. We're done, right? Okay, all right. If I work really hard, I get an award. And suddenly you'll start to get a situation where people start to resent the guy who gets the award because it's like, oh, I guess he worked harder than everybody else, And people, instead of, feeling, competing to be the guy who gets the award for working hard, everyone kind of thinks the guy who gets the award is a bit of a show-off. Right? And then you have a situation where people are like, hey, I worked really hard to become a doctor. Why did I do that? I can't buy any new land. I can't start a business. I can't buy a new, I get paid 5 times what everyone else gets paid because I'm a doctor, but that doesn't mean anything. I basically have the same as everybody else. It starts to hit a problem. After the first burst, okay? After the first, leap, which are titanic, right? People going from illiteracy to literacy, people going from not having running water and electricity to having it. People want to minimize that and say, oh, that doesn't matter. Oh, what was it? One of these individuals, I think it was C.L.R. James. He said, oh, humans are not hogs and sheep. Right? Who cares if the human life expectancy goes up? Human beings are not hogs and sheep. Oh. Herb Bryant, thank you for your super chat. But sometimes you'll get social democrats, Trotskyites, anarchists who poo-poo that. And they're just like, oh, okay, so everyone can read and write. That's great. It's like, yeah, actually it is great. Oh, I guess the life expectancy went up by 20 years. That's great. It's like, yeah, actually that's great. When people are living 20 years longer than they used to live, that's pretty damn good. You get these arrogant middle-class intellectuals who are like, oh, who cares if life gets better? What does life expectancy prove? That's what Destiny said to me when I debated Destiny Stephen Bunnell. He said, what does life expectancy prove? A goddamn lot, Destiny. It tends to mean a lot when people have access to food, when people have access to education, when people have access to health care, and as a result, they live longer. That means a lot, right? But this middle class arrogance that's just like, oh, we don't care about that. I mean, that's unbelievable to me. But after you get over that initial stage, after the first, stage of industrialization, after a country industrializes, after a country advances, that system, you can call it Stalinism or actually existing socialism, it has problems. It does have problems. After a certain stage, it develops problems. And that's why in Vietnam and in China and in Cuba and in other socialist countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, they've moved to have more of a market sector, because you can't, if you want to keep growth going, you need to start to, have a private sector at that point. So, there you go. But yeah, Stalinist, I mean, look, I think most people consider it an insult because we're all taught that Stalin is this evil, satanic figure, worse than Hitler, never did any good thing in his entire life. Every day he just woke up and said, "Mwahaha, how can I kill more people?" And so if you call somebody a Stalinist, you're saying you're just like that guy. That's probably why most people consider it an insult. But Stalin himself did not approve of the term. In academia, it refers to an economic and political model. So that's my answer to that question. All right, the Yugoslav-Soviet split. 1948, Yugoslavia cut ties with the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia became the first socialist country to not have a relationship with the USSR. Yugoslavia supported the USA during the Korean War. Yugoslavia was part of the non-aligned movement. Up in the 70s and 80s, it was very much an opponent of the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia and Tito, they were very, very critical of the Soviet Union. In Nelson Peary's, in Nelson Peary's autobiography, he actually tells a very funny story. Nelson Peary was a very important communist organizer during the 1950s and 60s. He was in the Communist Party in 1948. He had fought in the Second World War, African-American communist. And he was at the state convention of the Communist Party in Minnesota. And they were having resolutions, and everyone was they were unanimous, all the resolutions. Resolution to support the labor union, unanimous. Resolution to oppose racism, unanimous. Well, there was a resolution to support Tito. And so it was going to be passed unanimous, but then Nelson Peary raised his hand and he said, "I don't agree with Tito. I think Tito's kind of a revisionist, like Earl Browder, and that some of his ideas are not Marxist." He said the room just fell silent. And it was like awkward, and then they took a vote, and everyone else voted for it. Then afterwards, he was taken aside, and they said to him, "Oh, gee, we don't think the party is right for you. You don't really seem to get how we do things." Then the next morning, the headline in the Daily Worker was, "Stalin denounces Tito." And so they acted like nothing had ever happened, and people thought, wow, this guy must be really smart because Stalin denounced Tito. It's really kind of funny. And it shows you how there can be a culture of authoritarianism that develops in communist groups sometimes. That's not good. That's not good, right? And then the fact that he just raised a concern. Hey, I don't like this. And everyone was just like, he disagreed. And then what saved him from getting kicked out of the party or whatever is that, well, the next day Stalin said the same thing, so he was all right. And it shows you the kind of the authoritarianism, right? And I was in a group like that. I mean, I was in a like that. When I read that, I knew exactly what they were writing about because I was in a room full of people whose parents had been in the Communist Party. Thank you, Captain Waffles, for your super chat. Much appreciated. It will help our efforts. I was in a group for a long time, and most of them, their parents had been in the Communist Party, and they'd become, Vietnam War protesters and Maoist, Trotskyites or whatever, and they were just like this. We would have national committee meetings, and there would be a vote, and it would be unanimous every time. And if someone voted differently, they would take you aside and say, "Why are you being so uncomradely? Why are you being so disrespectful? That's not how we do things here. You need to support our leadership." That's not a good way of doing things. And that's why the group is falling apart now. You look at the group. When I was in it, it was about 300 people. Now it's probably less than 60 people, because it's rigged to keep certain people in charge. Those people don't have any new ideas. Those people are very arrogant, and this is what happens. And this is a problem. A lot of communist groups end up like that. You don't want to be that way. If you can't adjust your socialism, it's not going to survive. And the same goes for leftist and revolutionary organizations. If you cannot adjust your tactics, you're not going to survive. You know, and it's really important. You know, you can. I mean, look, Lenin said that if the situation changes in 24 hours, then the tactics must also change in 24 hours, right? A lot of these communist groups have not changed their tactics in 40 years. So, you know, there you go. Okay. Capital flight from China. Well, I assume the main factor in that. I don't know how much that is happening. I know it, you know, there's been, you know, the main factor is the new Cold War. The fact that the United States is starting a trade war with China, that countries are basically being forced to pick, do you want to trade with the United States, do you want to trade with China? I'm sure that's probably the primary factor. Could we avoid using should we avoid using the term communism? Using communism. All right. All right, so Dana Annex asked about Fusion City and how it could expand the efforts around fusion energy. Well, the reason it would expand those efforts is because right now, China is doing great efforts and great work around fusion energy. There are also, there's a fusion lab in Boston. There's a fusion energy research facility in New Jersey. There are people in Iran who are working on fusion energy. There are people in Russia working on fusion energy. And they're not working together on it. You know, because of the way fusion energy is being approached, it is almost a competition, right? The idea of Fusion City is that all of the fusion energy researchers would be brought to one single location. We would create a science UN in the heartland of America. In Kansas or in Nebraska, we would take a bunch of land and we would declare it to be an international territory. And we would fly in all the Chinese scientists. Thank you, Jacob Maxey, Fusion City Now. We fly in all the Chinese scientists, all the Russian scientists, all the Iranian scientists, all the American scientists, all the scientists in South Africa, all the scientists in India, and have the entire world putting all of its resources and all of its energy into one united effort to get fusion energy and defeat fossil fuels. That's the idea. And Fusion City, I mean, they're already making, I mean, read about their artificial sun in China, the artificial sun and what they're doing. It's amazing. Imagine that all of the world's energy and resources was combined into one single location for an emergency program to rescue humanity from fossil fuels. That's Fusion City. And if you think we're making progress now, it would speed ahead by light years. Fusion City must be built. It is the only response to climate change. Someone comes to you and says, oh, I'm concerned about climate change. Say, oh, good, so are we. Are you for Fusion City or are you against it? That's it. If someone's really serious about addressing climate change, they believe in Fusion City. And if someone's not serious, they don't. And it's that simple. Fusion City is the only real answer to the climate crisis, right? Yeah, you think you're going to make the world poorer, you're going to make people around the world just have less, you're going to reduce the human population. No, none of that's going to work, right? The only real solution to climate change is getting to a higher mode of energy production. That's the only answer. It's the only answer. The only realistic answer. Humans want more than they already have. Human beings want to get to a higher stage. The only way you defeat an ecological crisis is by moving to a higher mode of production. The first ecological crisis in human history was when we got too darn good at hunting and gathering. We got so good at hunting and gathering that there was a scarcity of animals. There was a scarcity of fruits and nuts to gather. So what did we do? Did we go backward? No, because humans don't go backward. They don't, right? We moved forward. We developed agriculture, farming, growing crops, domesticating animals. And as a result of that, we solved the first ecological crisis. There was no longer a scarcity. When there is an ecological crisis, like we're seeing right now with climate change, the answer is to change the way we interact with our environment. The way we are currently interacting with our environment is not sustainable. So we need to move to a more efficient way of doing it. We need to get off of fossil fuels, and we need to, adopt fusion energy. And on top of that, we need to get rid of the rule of profits and move towards socialism. And if we do that, we will not have an ecological crisis anymore. Got to move forward, can't move backward. All right, should we stop using the word communism? I'm not opposed to it. All right, I'm not opposed to it. It's a tricky word, okay? Right? Originally, socialism was really popular in the age of Karl Marx. There are all kinds of different forms of socialism. So Marx said, well, I'm going to call myself a communist to refer to my specific kind of socialism. All right? And then Karl Marx formed the International Working Men's Association, and a bunch of crazy anarchists who blew things up and shot people were calling themselves communists. So, towards the end of Marx's life, something called the Social Democratic Party of Germany was formed. They were all Marxists, and they're like, we're not going to call ourselves communists because we don't want to be associated with these crazy extremists that are blowing things up. So we're going to be socialists or social democrats, and that way people don't think we're extremists. And then you go to 1917, 1913, World War I breaks out. All these big socialist parties supported World War I. So Lenin comes back from exile, and he shows up in Russia, and he says, okay, we want people to know that we're not the sellouts who supported World War I. We got to let people know we're an anti-war, anti-imperialist party. We don't want people to think we're the party that supported the war. So instead of calling ourselves socialists or social democrats, we're going to call ourselves communists. We'll be communists again. It's like, okay. And then, during the Cold War, the term communist referred to people that were aligned with China or the Soviet Union or communist countries, and socialists or social democrats were the ones who were not, right? Nowadays, right, now it's a tricky word. It's a tricky word. That's really all it gets down to, okay? At the end of the day, right, it depends what it means to different people in different contexts. Right now, most Americans think socialism is free health care and free education. Socialism is the left wing of the Democratic Party. And if we want people to know we're something different than that, we should probably call ourselves something different, right? Like communists. But at the same time, communism is still, people think, the Cold War. They think the Soviet Union, they think violent revolution in the streets, so maybe we should call ourselves scientific socialists or 21st century socialists or anti-imperialists. There's different ways of doing it. I generally tell people that I don't shy away from the word communism and that I'm an advocate of 21st century scientific socialism. That's generally what I tell people. I advocate a socialism with American characteristics, a socialism that is unique to the United States. I'm from the Marxist-Leninist tradition, but I also am a Christian. I also am a Bolivarian. I'm also I'm inspired by Bolivarianism. I'm inspired by Baathism. I'm inspired by socialism with Chinese characteristics. I think we should study all of it and blindly follow none of it. And thank you for the super chat, good sir. I appreciate the super chat. Don't know how to say your name, but I appreciate it. That's what I tell people, right? It really, at the end of the day, these labels don't mean that much. Their meaning changes based on the context, based on where it is that you're talking to people and the context of the political conversation that you're having. It depends. At the end of the day, you should define yourself not by what label you put on yourself, but rather what you are for. It is the program that defines the revolutionary movement. And that's why we have our 4-point plan, we have Fusion City, we have the Sandino-Zapata Economic Corridor. That's what defines us, is our program. Our program is what defines us. At the end of the day, if you're going around and telling working people they should vote for you, they should support your political party, they're not going to ask what you call yourself. They're going to ask, what are you for? What do you want to do? And if you can give a concise, decisive answer to that question, there you go. And on that note, folks, I think that's our stream. We're going to end for today. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.